Attention startup leaders. Are you strapped for time but hungry for strategic insights? Introducing Managed Chaos, your go-to podcast for navigating the startup world in less time than your morning commute. Join us as we share expert advice, real-world examples, and actionable strategies to help you scale your business, allocate resources effectively, and achieve visionary results. Tune into Managed Chaos and join a community of like-minded innovators on the path to entrepreneurial success.
Welcome to Managed Chaos Podcast, where we give you the startup business rundown in less time than it takes for you to get to work. I'm Katrina Purcell.
And I'm Rachel Anderson.
And today we're going to actually go back in time. Forward in time. We're going to go ahead and go back and revisit our second half 2024 predictions and see how we did.
Yep, I'm very excited about this because we're going to pause everything to really go back and take a look. You and I already talked about this. The first learning we can say for sure is that 6 months is not enough time. So we're definitely going to do a year in the future. But you know what? We're going to stick to our word for this one, and we're going to wrap it up.
Yeah, so I do think we could probably have trends every 6 months, but we can't really say how they played out, right? So we're going to try and say whether or not we were right or wrong. But really what we're going to do is probably have more of a conversation around the trends and just what we're seeing. And so we're going to start with Rachel's first prediction, which was that inflation was definitely going to keep being a problem. Rachel, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I think this is sort of a twofold one. So on the one hand, I do think inflation was a bit of a problem, but honestly, it's hard to tell if that was the problem. And so really, we've seen a lot of tech layoffs continue over the second half, but comparatively, it's been less than what they really predicted from the first half. I think when you and I were chatting just a little bit before we started recording, we looked like maybe it would be 20K less. Is that right?
It's actually going to be a bit more than that. So I think based off of TechCrunch, it's looking so far, we're trending with October added in to be about 68,000 so far for second half. And it was over 181,000 for the first half.
Yeah. Okay. So the prediction is much. Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think, in the last 6 months, we've seen a lot of different things that are sort of affecting some of the business decisions that leaders are making. I actually know several people that have been caught in layoffs in the last 6 months, people that have been at their companies for 15, 20 years. And then people that obviously haven't been there that long. And all of them, regardless of their experience, their number of years, their industry, have really struggled to get rehired at a company. And so we're seeing not just the layoff decrease, we're also seeing the rehire decrease. And I think that it's just sort of a reflection of where the state of the US is right now. A lot of things that are sort of in flux or uncertain, and businesses are trying to be more conservative in how they hire and what their budgets are. And I think sometimes in the face of that uncertainty, the cost of an employee seems like the easier cutback, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I think that that's often the trend we see.
And we did see a rate cut. And so, the Fed fund rate did cut, which those of us who are saving in those high interest savings accounts definitely felt. I did hear some murmur already about lower cost of capital, but we're definitely nowhere near the free money era for sure.
Yeah. My prediction on this one is that, squishy if we predicted it right, but I think that we're actually still going to see a little bit more come through as things settle up a little bit.
Yeah, we even had a few companies that were doing sort of second round of 2024 layoffs, which is never a great sign. And I'm hoping things will be calmer going into the holidays. But as you said, the tightening of jobs actually being available. And so I've heard quite a few people who weren't even caught in the layoffs, but are just looking for something new, saying, it's hard to tell if those job postings are actually real. And some companies are posting things saying they're hiring, but they aren't actually sort of going through with it, or they're not doing any interviews. So our second prediction was increasing revenue over product launches.
Okay.
What do you think on this one?
Yeah. Okay. So my call on this one is that it's really too early to call. And this is where that 6 month mark probably wasn't enough. So, it's hard to call if this is successful because we're really still in the thick of it. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of things that are still in flux in the US. We're trying to figure out the election things. We're trying to figure out economy things. We're trying to figure out, there's another big one that I'm totally blanking on right now. Financial things. I think the Feds started affecting some of the interest rates a couple weeks ago as of the recording of this podcast. And so, there's just a lot of question marks for how that will affect the average consumer's life, which obviously then affects the business life. So we're really going to have to let this one play out. I think that we're actually going to get a lot more information once we get a couple months into the new year. That's for a couple of reasons. One is that budgets reset for a lot of companies, not all companies, but a lot of companies. So they're going to have a little bit more spend that they can either reignite into business, into plans, into products. I also think that it just gets us enough forward in time that hopefully there's answers to some of the things that were really question marks over the summer that I don't think have quite been resolved, and really trying to figure out all these things. So I don't see that we are going to be out of this like question mark of risk in 2024. I think we'll do that in 2025. I think it'll still be a lot of tidying up for businesses, switching around with their executives, I think that we've seen that in 2024, that they're still tidying up a lot of the business, tightening belts, switching around executives, which I know you and I talked about, or going to talk about in a second, leaning into some of the strengths of their current portfolio and really making sure that they're set up for whatever might come. And we've seen that through some, McKinsey surveys and some other data-driven companies that really release reports. And so, I'm going to say this one's really just too early to call at this point.
All right. How about personalization is critical?
Okay. I'm going to say I nailed this one, but I'm also going to say that it was an easy win. I mean, this is kind of predictable. Personalization has really been key in marketing and sales for quite a while now. And so it's not a new thing. I think that AI was the expectation of doubling down on that personalization, because now AI can make everything incredibly easy to do, scalable, quicker, etc. And we saw some data come out in the last few months that talk about how 97% of companies are actually now delivering a personalized experience, and that 90% of companies use AI power to do that. But here's my one kind of key caveat that I think we're not quite seeing yet, or that we still are looking for. And that's the B2C versus B2B component. So in B2C, because you're reaching out direct to a consumer or customer, it's really easy to personalize. That person has a name, that person has desires, that person has data. Like, you can really target them. But in B2B, it's just not that simple. The whole entire company makes whole different decisions than the individuals that make up that company. And so I think that with personalization, we really are still going to have to explore what it looks like to be personalized from a B2B context. And I think because of that, one of the early trends that we're seeing is something called micro markets, where you can get hyper specific to target an extremely specific consumer. And I think that might work really well for the business world, especially for small businesses. And, there's a lot of capital and money out there to be made B2B. And if you can find a really specific niche, there are companies who will pay you just simply because they need you to understand the niche. So
is that a new trend that you just popped out there? Yeah, there you go. So that slip that one in.
Yep, I gave that one away for free. Well, I'll probably have this come back up in the 2025 ones when we do the predictions. But I think that for that one, we nailed it, and we're still seeing how that grows.
Perfect. All right. So now we're going to go into my predictions. My first one was AI. And it was really from the perspective, not of how to get it into products, but more so it was from how to get it into the products, not just from the use of it to automate processes internally. I do think, so this one is a bit of like a double-edged, I don't know, it's a squishy one, as Rachel would say. Funding actually declined a little bit. So AI is still seeing about 28% of venture dollars in Q3. But there's actually, most of that's coming from very large rounds, right? And so it's the total dollars are remaining high, but the deal flow to kind of AI companies is declining over the past 2 quarters. And Q3, actually, this is the first time that it slipped below 1,000 rounds for the first time since late 2022. Mm. And really what that's showing us is that proven AI startups are really getting an outsized venture investment. And so those seed, Series A startups, they're really not seeing the level of investment that they were. And so maybe starting a company based on AI isn't really going to pay off for you as much now as it would have in, let's say, late 2022. The piece that I missed completely is AI agents. And I think it's been really interesting and exciting to kind of look at what Microsoft has done with their Microsoft Copilot. I do think there's something to be said, and we'll talk about this in the cybersecurity piece, but like, do we trust Microsoft agents? Like, I don't know about you, I'm an Apple person to the core because I feel more protected and secure, and I'm not worried about being hacked. So that kind of brought up something for me there. And then Anthropic had Claude's computer use, right? So let's start having AI actually do the research for our upcoming vacation and plan out the whole vacation and update our calendar invites, which, can take away some tasks that maybe we don't want to do. But I think it definitely is showing that 2025 should be really interesting, and probably we should buckle up or have our AI buckle us up.
Yeah. And this is something else that I think maybe we should punt over into our trends is, what does this mean for the startup and small business, this tightening of pockets and investing more in like kind of the tried and true brand? Does it mean that startups and small businesses should look for their funding from angel investors because they can connect individually and explain value in a way where people are maybe more adapt to risk? Or should they look to partnerships with some of these bigger, more established ones that get the bigger funding and kind of do this more like partnership, bonding, cash run that way? We'll have to see. But I think that this one is a really interesting sort of outcome from prediction. But your next prediction, as you mentioned, was all about cybersecurity and really how you thought it might be a bigger issue for small businesses. So what did you see?
So I think this one is a bit tricky. Did I get it right? Did I not get it right? I don't know. We might have to debate that one. I do think that smaller companies do need to be paying attention to sort of the larger trends that are happening for the large scale global companies, right? So the 2 weeks for the Olympics in Paris, there were more than 140 cyber attacks. They were able to have none of them disrupt events, but still, right? That's a big deal. And then in July, I luckily was not affected by this, but businesses, governments, literally worldwide were disrupted by a major IT outage. It affected 8.5 million Microsoft Windows devices. It caused widespread disruption. Banks, broadcasters, airlines, healthcare, retail, like everything, all because of a flawed update to a cloud-based security software, CrowdStrike. And I think it just shows you, number one, how interconnected the world is, but then number two, just how important it is that, God, we should have an episode on this, but like when you're releasing code, how important it is to smoke test and, do all the things you need to do so you don't crash literally the global economy. But one interesting point is that cybersecurity is really often thought of as a sector that would be resilient, right, in downturns. And in Q3, venture funding for cyber startups actually really tumbled, right, to only $2.1 billion, which is not a lot. And more surprisingly, there were only 116 cybersecurity funding deals done in Q3, right, which is the lowest since 2013. So the question is, I guess they've cornered the market on cyber, right? There is, though, still a skills gap. And so as we talk about, professionals and people who've been part of layoffs, it seems like 90% of organizations have experienced a security breach in the last year, right? And most of them can attribute that, at least partially, to basically having no cybersecurity skills on their teams, right? And so there's a skills gap shortage there. And maybe that ties into a place where folks can start to think about looking for jobs.
Yeah, that one's interesting to me as well, because I know someone who's looking and hiring and like going through the process for jobs in cybersecurity. And, there's a lot of companies that either aren't hiring for it, to your point, or they're expecting way more experience. And so I think there's an interesting learning curve there, both from a hiring perspective of the startups for value in that cybersecurity role and really bringing people in to help them. I know, about 10 years ago now, there was a major hack through Target, someone that should be well established, having cybersecurity, having the protocols in place. And the hackers the breach got in through their HVAC vendor, because the vendor didn't have the protocols and the security, and they found the in. So I really think that with the cybersecurity front, you said it's tricky. And, I think tricky only because of the way that we made our prediction.
Yeah.
But I think that honestly, it's going to become non-negotiable for businesses of all sizes if they want to do business for other people, whether that's a big business, that's a government agency, anything that is sort of more established. So Personally, I think you were spot on with cybersecurity, just with maybe a little tiny caveat.
Yeah, I agree. And then I'm going to try and wrap up our last one very quickly so we keep on our timeline here. Nearshoring or even onshoring of tech resources, I think this one is just way too early. We need longer than 6 months. I will say I'm getting so many reach outs, though, from folks who have engineering talent in Latin America. And I do think that is kind of the next big boom in terms of being able to get resources at rates that are reasonable for startups or companies that are just wanting to really quickly get engineering teams that are in time zone. And so I think that's when we'll have to keep watching in 2025. But thank you for joining us. Hopefully next time we'll do a whole year to see if our predictions became a reality. But hopefully you learned something on this episode of Managed Chaos Podcast. And we cannot wait to see you again on next week's episode.
This was another informative episode of Managed Chaos, the podcast for startups. You can find us on all of your favorite podcasting apps, as well as on Instagram and YouTube, where we are at Managed Chaos Podcast. For additional resources or to continue the conversation, you can find Katrina Purcell and Rachel Anderson on LinkedIn.